All right, I have the thumbs up, so we're going to call this meeting to order. This is a pretty straightforward meeting tonight. We usually start this off with public comment, but there's no one here in the audience with us, so we will skip that agenda item and move straight into our study session with the one and only Jennifer.
Okay, good evening. I'm Jennifer Hughes from the Planning and Zoning Division. And the key item on our agenda tonight is a study session on file ZDO 271, and this is to get everyone prepped and ready for the public hearing that will follow on this proposal on November 26th. I think at least a couple of you, maybe several of you, were on the commission at the time that we originally adopted our marijuana-related land use regulations, but I know for a number of you this is new. And so the idea was really just to give you background on how we got where we got at the county level in terms of regulating marijuana land uses, and then to introduce what the proposal is for this round, and just to kind of tell you what the next steps are. I would assume that this is going to generate quite a bit of public interest. I could end up being wrong about that, but I'll be somewhat surprised if we don't have a full house. Both proponents and opponents of marijuana legalization have tended to turn out in force when we've considered things in the past, and so I would assume that that's likely to happen again. And so I think the more information, the better, so that you're ready to go on November 26th. So as I said, it's file ZDO 271, marijuana production license limits. Background, so legalization of marijuana in Oregon, I don't know how many people have followed this, so I apologize if this is repetitive, but medical marijuana has been legal in the state of Oregon since 1998. Recreational marijuana was legalized by the voters in 2014, and there was a time period allowed for the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, who has regulatory authority. They were charged with having the regulatory authority over marijuana, recreational marijuana that is. They had about a year to ramp up, so it was legalized in November of 2014, actually became legal in the summer of 2015 for personal use, the growing of the 4 plants that people are allowed to have just as part of their, their dwelling. But the commercial licensing didn't get started until January of 2016. At the same time, medical marijuana became regulated somewhat differently. They did sort of expand the regulatory provisions related to medical marijuana at about the same time. There was about a 2-month delay, so we'll kind of cover that in a second. Local authority to regulate marijuana land uses. So, what sort of authority do cities and counties have to regulate beyond what's provided for in state law? First of all, local governments do have the right to what we call opt-out of allowing most marijuana-related land uses. There are a couple of exceptions to that. We cannot opt out of allowing the sort of personal, the minimum, the 4 plants per household. There's some minimums on the medical side. We cannot, that are just sort of personal to your dwelling. And we can't opt out of allowing the production of medical marijuana. So even if it's at a larger scale than sort of just what you would be able to have with your dwelling. All of the other categories, the county or cities can theoretically opt out of permitting those. In jurisdictions where the voters did not vote in favor of legalizing recreational marijuana in 2014, and I think there was a percentage, and I don't know what that is off the top of my head, about sort of how badly it had to lose. In those counties, the local governing body could just opt out. But in counties such as Clackamas County, where we didn't, it passed in Clackamas County, opting out would require a referral to the voters. So our board opted not to refer to the voters back in, after this passed in 2014. And so we are required under the current framework then to permit all of the categories of marijuana land uses. So if you don't opt out, there are a couple of kind of threshold things that you have to allow. First of all, marijuana production, so that's the growing of marijuana, is defined as a farm use under state law explicitly, and it must be allowed in the exclusive farm use zone. So we don't have the flexibility to just not permit it in our EFU district. And then each category of use has to be allowed somewhere. And we'll talk a little more about what those categories are. So that's kind of the bare minimum. We can allow more, but we have to at least allow that. State law also provides for what we call time, place, and manner restrictions at the local level. So although we have to allow every category, we don't have to allow it completely unfettered. We are allowed to regulate. And there's another caveat: the regulations have to be reasonable. Do we know what reasonable is? No, not really. It's not something that's explicitly defined. Presumably, it could be fleshed out through case law if we were to be challenged on our regulations at some point. Clackamas County at this point has not been challenged on the existing time, place, and manner regulations that we've had in place now since 2016. So what is the county doing, or what have we done? What's our history with regulating marijuana? First of all, on January 4th of 2016, we applied regulations to recreational marijuana. So that process is something we went through there was quite an extensive process. After the ballot measure passed in 2014, the board appointed a task force. We met, we talked to various stakeholders on both the pro and con side of legal marijuana. The Planning Commission held study sessions and public hearings. The board held study sessions and public hearings. We had approximately 400 people turn up for the first Planning Commission hearing when the regulations were being considered initially. Those took effect, as I said, January 4th, 2016. There was a slight delay, and that was just a creature of the way that the state had done the administrative rules, which is that our authority to regulate medical marijuana didn't kick in until March 1st. So that's that delay. On March 1st, 2016, the regulations were applied to medical marijuana. Then in 2017, the board wanted to make some changes. And so again, the Planning Commission held hearings, much less interest that second time around. It was a fairly narrow set of changes. The substantive provisions were to impose some fencing standards and to allow some types of marijuana processing in our farm zones, so in the exclusive farm use and ag forest zones. Previously, in that first round in 2016, we did not allow the processing of either extracts or concentrates in our farm zones. Even though state law allowed for it, we chose not to do that. And so then the board ultimately ended up allowing concentrate processing, but not extract processing. Happy to talk about what the distinctions are, although it's really not going to be relevant for what you're considering in November. I'm happy to answer all kinds of questions about all this stuff as we move along. So that happened in 2017, and those regulations took effect in the summer of 2017. So the current county regulations, for the most part, our marijuana-related land use regulations are in ZDO Section 841. That was initially adopted, as I said, in 2016. You did have a copy of that in your email this week, and you have a hard copy in front of you. I think it's good just to part of the reason I want to give you this background is because I think it's likely that the testimony you receive will be broad-based and may well relate to things that really aren't on the table for consideration. And I think it's just useful to kind of understand what people are saying to you, even if it's if it's way off topic. And so I certainly encourage you to at least become familiar with the basic provisions of Section 841. You could certainly get requests on both sides to loosen or strengthen those regulations. That will not be properly before you in this hearing because we will have notified very specifically for what we're going to do. And I will cover that more in a moment. But I just think that background is useful then in understanding what people are testifying about and being able to sort of ask questions or converse with them and potentially put something on the list for the future. You never know when our next work program decisions are made. So ZDO Section 841 applies in our natural resource and rural residential zones where regulated marijuana land uses are allowed. So again, every zone where people are living, you can have that minimum for recreational plants. And there have been some changes on the medical side, but it was, and I think still generally is, 6 plants for a cardholder, 12 plants for an individual dwelling, regardless of the number of cardholders. I think that's still accurate. And that's just allowed, that's not regulated through 841. So we're talking about something where they're producing at a higher level than that. And we only permit that in certain zones. And then beyond that, we only apply ZDO 841 in some of those zones. So it is kind of this layered approach. So 841 applies in natural resource zones. That's our exclusive farm use, our timber, and our ag forest district. So those are the 3 that allow commercial farming. They allow commercial forestry. They typically have 80-acre minimum lot sizes moving forward. Obviously, there's a lot of pre-existing small lots. And they're heavily regulated at the state level in terms of what's permitted and prohibited in those districts. In addition, we apply ZDO 841 in two rural residential zones, so our 5 and 10 acre zones. In addition, just to note, regulation of medical marijuana production is more limited. So we don't have as much authority under state law to regulate the way in which medical marijuana is produced. There's a little bit of whether it was intentional or not, I don't know, but the way that the rules are written, we just don't have quite the latitude to regulate as many different factors related to medical marijuana. So they get potentially some exemptions from some of the standards related to things like odor and noise and lighting. In exchange for having a larger setback, some of those standards are waived, and it is just because of the nature of the limitations that we have under state law to regulate. I will tell you that almost everything that we're seeing now in terms of applications and that we have seen since 2016 are recreational producers. You know, I can't give you an exact number, but I can tell you that the number of people coming to us that want to produce medical marijuana on a large scale is minimal. So, and then what is 841? It covers a number of different things, but it's things like standards for noise, for odor, for access requirements if you're on a private road, water rights, there's a number of different things, waste disposal, those kinds of things. 841 does not apply in the commercial and industrial zones that permit these uses, and there are some of our commercial and industrial zones that allow some marijuana-related uses. It's very specific depending on which commercial zone or which industrial zone and which category of use we're talking about, but generally speaking, we prohibit outdoor activity. We have minimum separation distances for retailers, so from things like schools and also from each other. And we have limits on the size of those uses, so like the amount of square footage that can be devoted on a particular piece of property to marijuana-related uses. In many of the commercial and industrial districts, there's a cap. And I think the concern there was how much industrial land are we going to use up on this one industry when industrial land is scarce? The board had some concerns about that. So, but 841 does not apply in the commercial and industrial districts. So specifically, what you're going to be considering under ZDO 271 is related to restrictions on marijuana production. So there are 4 categories of marijuana uses outlined in state law. There is retailing, wholesaling, processing, and production. And just to make things confusing, they don't use quite the same terminology on the medical side, so it's called a medical, I believe they call it a registered grow site, whereas on the recreational side, it's production, but it's all the same thing, you're growing. And so we are not proposing any substantive, and I'll talk about some kind of minor edits, but the substantive changes we're proposing all fall within the category, it's just production that we're talking about. No changes for processing, retailing, or wholesaling that are of significance. Currently, we limit production. There is a maximum 20,000 square feet of building area in industrial zones. And that's what I mentioned a minute ago. It relates to not using up too much of our industrial land on one industry. And though the 20,000 square foot cap applies on a per lot basis, and it applies to whatever marijuana uses they're doing on the site. So if they happen to be running a processing business, which in an industrial zone would be quite possible, that would count toward the 20,000. If they also happen to be growing, that would count. If there were several different marijuana related businesses on the same lot, it all totals up to 20,000 square feet per lot. And no outdoor production is permitted in those zones. In the RFF5 and FF10, so those are the 2 rural residential zones that permit commercial production, there is a fairly restrictive standard. It's a maximum 5,000 square feet of building area. And that is, in both the case of the 20,000 and the 5,000, we're not talking about canopy area, we're not talking about the number of plants, because that's what's important at the state level in terms of licensing. We're talking about literally the building area they're allowed to devote to any activity related to marijuana production. So, for example, in an RFF5 zone where you have a 5,000 square foot cap, that's not just your canopy. That's your employee break room and your bathrooms and your where you're trimming and drying. It's everything related to that marijuana use. So we're not proposing, as part of this effort, any changes to those two standards. I would argue those are both more restrictive in all likelihood than what we're going to be talking about on the natural resource side, which is the proposal. So currently, there is no cap on the size of marijuana production in the EFU, timber, and ag forest zones. So we don't limit the number of licenses. We don't limit whether you can have medical and recreational grows on the same site. We don't limit at the local level. There are limits at the state level to some extent, but we don't limit any of that. We don't talk about how much building area you can have. We have, as I said, noise, odor, lighting, things like that, and we have setbacks for outdoor production of 100 feet. Indoor production just has to meet the normal setbacks that you would have to meet for any agricultural building in those zones. I mean, it's hard to remember now because it's been a long road since, we started talking about this in 2015. But my recollection is that we didn't really think that the state licensing, at least when we started the process, that the state licensing was going to end up working the way that it worked in terms of what is permitted on an individual lot. I also think we didn't really want to get in the business of being the people who are out there measuring the canopy or counting the number of plants, and I think that factored in as well. There was probably also a thought that it's a farm zone and we don't restrict the, number of greenhouses you can have for nursery stock. So I think all of those things factored into the decision not to regulate that. Yes.
What is the state limit?
So I'm actually going to give you guys a handout.
If it's coming, I can wait.
Well,
we were just kind of going there, and I was curious.
Yeah, maybe it actually might be a good time to just pass this out at least because I don't have a slide on this. But this handout, our project manager actually on this project isn't me, despite the fact that I'm here talking your ears off tonight. It's Glenn Hamburg, who I think you met for the accessory dwelling unit package. So he'll actually be here for the hearing on the 26th, as will I. But he put this little summary together for a little staff meeting we had on this topic recently, and I thought it was pretty helpful. And so it gives you, from the state perspective, the limits on the recreational and the medical. So on the recreational, they have a tier 1 and tier 2, and what he's given you, and I think now they may even have like some sort of a micro option. So what he's given you is the biggest. So if you are a tier 2 licensee, you can have 10,000 square feet of indoor mature plant canopy or 40,000 square feet of outdoor mature plant canopy, or they allow you to do a proportionate mix. I am certainly not an expert on the state's marijuana industry, but it is my understanding that the idea was to level the playing field between indoor and outdoor production. So because you can produce more indoors per the same number of plants, because either they're able to be controlled more easily, you can control the growing conditions better, you can get more bloom cycles, whatever all those details are, the state was charged with trying to level that playing field. And that's the reason why the canopy size for outdoor is so much larger than it is for indoor. Then they have this, what they call the additional medical bump up, and this is something that has come about over the last couple of years. It's a little crazy making because I'm sure there are good reasons for it, but it feels like the administrative rules are changing like practically monthly in terms of marijuana. It is hard to sort of keep up with all the changes that have happened. And I think it's because they've been learning lessons as time has gone on, and then also there have been changes in the legislation that has then led to additional rulemaking, but there is this additional medical bump up. So normally medical marijuana is regulated by the Oregon Health Authority. It has been for as long as I have known that there was such a thing as regulating medical marijuana. They did not immediately, and they still have not put all of the regulatory authority for medical marijuana under the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, where the recreational marijuana is regulated. But there has started to be some overlap, some connections. And, again, at the local level, we don't get involved with that too much other than to just sort of try to at least understand the basics so we can refer people appropriately. But anyway, there is now this medical bump up. So you do not require a separate registration with the Oregon Health Authority to do that. You can do that under just dealing with the OLCC. As you can see, you can grow for up to 24 OMMP as the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program. card-holding patients, and it gives you 6 mature and 12 immature plants per patient, so then he's just done the math. And then what Glenn has done here is given you an estimate, just a range of what the canopy size might be for that many plants. I mean, obviously, we don't know exactly, but it's just some guidelines on what it might be. The thing that sort of makes all of this canopy stuff insignificant in terms of the impact on any one piece of property is that the OLCC does not restrict the number of licensed, they call them licensed premises per lot. So each licensee is capped, as this is explained, but you can have, in theory, an unlimited number of licensees on the same lot. So I could have 40 acres of EFU, and I could potentially have 40 licenses, each with my own 1 acre plot, each with my own, indoor or outdoor canopy, and that's not restricted. The OLCC is verifying or regulating who holds those licenses. So 1 license per licensee per tax lot. So if I am a licensee, Jennifer Hughes, I can have 1 on this 40-acre piece of EFU ground, but Brian could have 1, and Mary could have 1, and Tom could have 1. I could not have 2. So from a regulatory perspective, that may make a whole bunch of sense in terms of what the state's regulating for, but they're not regulating for the reasons that we are. We're regulating from a quality of life or land use impact standard, rather than for the concerns that they have about the black market and leakage out of state and all of those things that the state has to be concerned about, and tracking and all of that.
Jennifer, is there a setback standard for what you just described, or if you have multiple?
Not that I am,
one property?
yeah, not that I'm aware of. They have to, and we can get you links, and I'll be happy to do that to all the many, many pages of state regulations. But it's my understanding that you have to designate, this is my licensed premises as opposed to, and there may be some sort of a separation distance. It's not ringing a bell, but I can find out if there is something.
I recall that there was a visibility, that they had to have some type of screening for visibility. I don't remember if that was recommended by Clackamas or if it was state, but I remember that you weren't supposed to see it, and there was, various types of offsets from public access. I do recall there was something
By
for that
licensee.
someplace.
What was that?
But that wasn't by licensee, right? That was for the
Yeah.
whole.
I
That
think
was code.
Yeah.
And I want to say it was Clackamas County, but I may be wrong. And this is like, I don't recall seeing the final on the odor abatement, but
So we
Christie-
have setbacks, but they're not between licensees.
Right.
So we have a perimeter setback to buildings. We have a perimeter setback to outdoor, just fields of marijuana. But we don't say, oh, because you have 4 licenses, you have to have 10 feet or 20 feet or 50 feet between the licenses. Because again, we're not really concerned with how many licenses. We're concerned with, sort of this idea of the smell and the noise and the lighting and all of that. But what has happened over these intervening years is that in some cases, and I don't know the number, we're going to try to get some statistics before the hearing, but I don't know how easy it's going to be to extract that information out of our system. I don't know how many are doing multiple licenses per property, but there are at least a handful that have been relatively high profile where they have developed, for example, something like 30 or 40 licensed premises. And so even though, they're meeting all of the standards, I think, has felt to some as though it's a very industrial type use, particularly when they're indoor. So you have these, like building, and then related to that, you have a lot of activity that might be above and beyond what you would expect from a normal farm situation where you have, sort of one farmer growing Christmas trees or one farmer leasing his property out to a nursery, because you really have multiple farmers, meaning they've all got potentially their own employees and their traffic coming and going and car doors slamming in the middle of the night and things going on 24/7, 365 potentially at what have started to look sort of like some kind of like little industrial campuses. And that's sort of the pushback that I think that the county has gotten, which has led to this proposal.
Communal co-op, basically, it sounds like.
And that's the clarity. You said 1 license per tax lot per person or per organization.
Per entity, yeah.
So to build on the co-op definition, if 10 people were together and each had a license, but they each had a license at each other lot, they could have 100 licenses?
To my knowledge, they're not regulating the number of licenses that I could have, for instance, as long as they're spread out. I can verify that, but I'm fairly confident it's based on just the individual location, but that may not be true. And I can check that.
And the licenses cost money.
Yes, they do.
And I had
The
some,
production of what you can
But each
produce
license
versus what you can
defines what you
sell
can.
is, I don't think you have a big issue with that.
Okay.
Louise?
I had a couple questions. Trying to get squared here. Now, here it says for the outdoor use, 40,000 square feet outdoor is the maximum recreational canopy size. But here on our slide, it says no cap on the size of production in those zones. So is this based on each licensee is 40,000 square feet, which is
Correct.
roughly a little under an acre?
Yes.
But in other words, therefore, no, if you have 1,000 acres and you have that many licensees.
You could cover the
Okay,
whole
so
thing.
I just wanted to square that away.
Correct, that's
And-
right.
And my other secondary question is, some of these zonings have a very strict usage, such as timber. It is only allowed for the production of commercial timber. So has the zoning, maybe I'm out of it when it comes to zoning regulations, but now they're allowing another use on a very restricted zoning? In other words, they're allowing marijuana to be grown on a lot for timber only?
So timber zoning is actually not timber only. It's zoned that way because it is considered to be especially suitable for the growing of timber. You know, at some point when the county went through in the 80s and decided this is for, it wasn't called timber at the time, but it was basically a precursor to that. This is farmland, this is forest land, and we also have a zone that's a hybrid, which is sort of considered to be an area where you had a really big, sort of a mix of farming and forestry. But those zones have always allowed both. So even though it's zoned one way, and that does have significant impacts in terms of the ways you qualify for a dwelling, there are uses, farm-related uses that you can do in EFU that you cannot do in timber. But the basic premise of can I grow commercial timber or can I be a commercial farmer, you can do that in all three of those zones, and it doesn't, that would be for any crop. Marijuana,
does-
we don't treat it differently.
Must affect timber tax deferral.
Yes, certainly. You could have people in, they might be in farm deferral as opposed to, correct. And that would be through the assessor as opposed through the zoning code. Yes.
Okay.
So we allow both.
Say if they have the power they need and they have the buildings, they can immediately begin to use that without any issue with the code and still maintain their timber deferral.
If, I'm sorry, if what?
Correct? If they have the outbuildings
Uh-huh.
and they happen to have the power and everything they need, they could begin to use that for this use without any problem. They wouldn't be, they would be in conforming use. If they started producing large volumes of marijuana in the existing infrastructure that was on
But
that
you're
property.
talking indoors, not outdoors.
Well, even outdoors.
I mean, we don't regulate the deferral program. That's the short answer. I don't know all the details. It'd be through the tax assessor. There are ways you can convert from a farm deferral to a forest deferral and vice versa. You could, I assume possible, you could have part of your property in one, I don't know. I know they'll pull part out for like a home site and leave some of it in deferral, but whether you could have some forest deferral and some farm deferral on the same tax lot, that I don't know.
If you're not adjusting your plan that you have for forest
Mm-hmm.
deferral and you have existing, and my memory of people who are really into timber is they tend to have some high use power usually. You know, if they were ever using that to actually do sawmills. Like they would probably have the transformers at the property. So that's what I remember going back with this marijuana thing is that you had real estate that was not really being used because timber wasn't like it was. They don't have to run afoul of their, because they have a plan that they file for this is my timber plan. And if that didn't plant trees in a part of the property, you know, they would likely be wide open without any impact. That's what I remember from that. So
be,
you
I
got
don't know.
your cake and ate it too with that piece of property, if you already had the buildings built.
So I'll just offer a couple quick thoughts. One is, I think it's worth pointing out that when this commission adopted these regulations back in 2016, the concept of multiple entities on a piece of property did not cross our minds at all, right? Everything we were, when we adopted these regulations, the thought was that one licensee or one entity would be on a property. And so this concept of multiple licensee is something that kind of came out of the process. And so that's kind of why we're revisiting it now.
I disagree. I remember specifically there was a concern, especially with so many permits allowed to grow in the medical side. The catch was, we expected the state to regulate it, in a way that we were gonna see where it went. That was what I remember.
I think you came in on the 2017 revisions and not the initial.
I think the end of
draft.
2016 is when I was here, but they had already been going. And I remember I missed a big town hall involved in this, like I was out of state. But I do remember that there was a real concern about people trying to manipulate, you know what I mean, for that concern. There's more marijuana code than this though, right?
Is that 841 that you're looking at?
This is 100% of the 271, ZDO 271.
Yeah, but you got ZDO 841 attached
Yeah.
to that memo, right? It's maybe 6 pages or
Because I remember
roughly.
a heck of a lot more dealing with extraction and those types of uses.
So those are all the standards
Yeah.
that pertain as far as like specific marijuana standards. There are references to marijuana sprinkled throughout the code in terms of definitions, in terms of not allowing it as a home-based, under a home occupation
Yeah.
permit. There are, each individual zone tells
stands.
you when the uses are which uses are permitted in which zone. So certainly the packet would have been much bigger
okay.
back then in terms of just sort of weaving that into the code. But in terms of the standards, this is the bulk of it. And really the only other, what I would call standards that we have is in the industrial zones, the 20,000 square feet and the no outdoor production. Those standards are just found right in the section of the code that regulates industrial. And then trying to think, the no outdoor for like in our commercial zones. So some of those things are found right in the individual zones, but the bulk of the stuff that you would really think about regulating marijuana, noise, odor, lighting, all that's what you have, 841.
So the other thing I was just going to point out that I think is worth noting that goes to Luis's comments, which is you all might recognize that in the RRFF zones and the industrial zones, production, it has to occur indoors, but in the EFU timber and ag zones, we are prohibited from actually regulating that, which is why it could be either indoor or outdoor. And one of the things that, I was on the original marijuana task force, and one of the things that the marijuana growers were adamant about, at least some of them, was the concept that, most businesses who were really serious about growing marijuana were going to do it indoors because it yielded a much higher quality crop as opposed to outdoors, and there was less you had to deal with in terms of temperature changes and a variety of other things. So I would just, one of the things I'm curious about, Jennifer, is if we have any actual statistics about how that has played out on EFU land and how much is actually being grown indoors versus outdoors, and I'm just curious of how that actually played out.
Yeah, and I don't know.
Right.
I have not, despite the fact that I felt like I was immersed in this stuff for about a year before we adopted our rules, never actually did any of the application processing.
Right.
So we've had 2 or 3 different staff people over the course of the almost 3 years now that we've been doing this. So I think that they could probably, and Glenn was one of them, might be able to just sort of anecdotally tell you what they think.
That would be great.
Whether we'll be able to truly, the issue is we've had a lot, I don't know, I want to say certainly at least a couple of hundred applications, probably more than that now. And so if it's sort of not in the database, then we have to pull out, 200 or 300 files and try to go through them and figure that out. And it's a sort of a resource question. But I know we were thinking about trying to at least get a sense on the multiple licenses question. And so if we end up doing some of that work, we could look for both things.
The next time, I'd just be curious to see a map where you would show us the properties that were actually, growing permitted, just to kind of get a map of where
We
it's
have
at in
that.
the
We
county.
have a map. What we can't tell you who's growing. We can tell you who got permission from us.
I just want to see
because-
just the general, is it like, because my impression it's all bottled up around
That's true.
Boring and Damascus, right? Like,
That's true.
I may be wrong, but it feels like it.
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
have the map available at the hearing. And I think it's been fairly recently updated, but we'll get it as, get it
I wouldn't want to
updated and
disclose
bring it.
who. I'm just
Yeah.
curious to see.
No, it's
where
fine. It's
distributed
available.
counties.
People have asked for it, and we have that information. It's just, it tells you whether we've approved a permit. It doesn't tell you if they subsequently we don't link it later to licensing records, so sometimes people get through our process and maybe they don't make it through the OLCC process, or for whatever reason, they think they're going to do this and then the business plan just doesn't work out. And so I'm sure that the number of actual grow sites is smaller, but I don't know by what factor, so.
And hemp is the same pathway, or is hemp a
No,
completely different thing?
No, hemp is completely different. In fact, the county is precluded from regulating hemp in zones that permit farm uses. So we have normally, local governments or counties, at least in rural areas, are, it's essentially, we cannot restrict farm use. It's right to farm. So we don't get to regulate, if people want to harvest Christmas trees with helicopters at, 2:00 in the morning, they get to do that. We are not allowed to regulate that at all. And so marijuana is a real exception to the way that things normally work. Because they did a couple things. One, they said we could have reasonable regulations on time, place, and manner, and then later even clarified by carving it out as explicitly that those time, place, and manner restrictions are an exception to the right to farm law. So it's very clear we have that authority, but we don't for hemp, and the law is very distinct in terms of that. So if you're doing hemp production, we're precluded from restricting it.
On top of Mark's question here, or just a comment about it, I opened up my zoning maps while I was studying this. And it does not identify where the marijuana productions were going on, but it does show you the different zonings and what could happen. And that was
Correct.
extremely helpful.
Yes.
If we had that in front of us, that would be extremely helpful.
Sure, we can do that. We can have the zoning map and the,
And another comment was, on timber zoning, there's an 80-acre minimum. So if you convert some of that property, if you're at 80 acres zoned timber, and you convert some of that to marijuana production, are you losing your timber designation by doing that?
you don't lose your zoning designation. So again, it's sort of strange because we think, oh, well, you have exclusive farm use. It must be exclusively farm use, but it really isn't. And the same thing with timber. Well, that must mean timber. Also not. I mean, those zones allow many other things. It's just that they have a focus on farming versus forestry, and it does make a difference in terms of some of sort of the related uses that you can have. So like EFU has provisions for agritourism, it has provisions for processing of farm crops that you can't do in a timber district. But the basic premise of can I grow crops, can I raise livestock, can I raise commercial timber, you can do both without any permission from the county in both of those zones and in the ag forest zone that is kind of combined. But deferral, which is I think what Louise was asking about, I don't know. That's really a tax assessment program. It's actually completely, sort of separate. Not that it isn't related that they're able to farm at least to get the deferral. That certainly relates to zoning, but whether they can maintain it or how they do that mix or whatnot is.
Yeah, my question is personal based, just because I have about 75 acres in the TBR zone. It used to be in a GTD, but it's only for commercial timber production, and I was told that I must stay in commercial timber production to get the timber tax deferral.
Yes.
And I could not farm, I could not, do anything else, including grow marijuana, not that I want to, but so that's what my question came from.
And if you were told that from the assessor, then I would certainly defer to that. And I think the question is, if you were to convert, all of a sudden you decided to harvest your timber and then, grind the stumps and convert your, to a vineyard or something, the zoning would permit that. It's just a question of what would that do to your deferral, and would the assessor then potentially, you have to there's a form that the Oregon Department of Forestry for a change of use when you're not going to reforest. You have to come and the county has to sign off saying that whatever use you're converting it to is permitted in the zone. And so we do that for people who do convert to farming. So I know it happens, but then how easy is it to maintain the new deferral? And, there's ramifications
It
there,
seemed like the marijuana legality complicated in a sense that people before wouldn't have thought about converting their timber zone to anything else.
Oh.
And then perhaps it made
Might
them
be more
think,
of
well,
a-
maybe, I could be more profitable.
Might be more of a motivation than
Right, yeah,
previously. That could
exactly.
be. I don't have any statistics on whether we're seeing conversions like that, or,
Okay.
at any great scale or not. But yeah.
So is it fair to say, though, that on a farm, if it's a straight farming production, if they chose to farm everything indoors, they could put up as many buildings as they chose?
Yes. Yes, that is correct.
So it would look
Within-
very industrial.
Yes, within some very minor limits. In other words, setbacks, which are
Right.
not particularly burdensome in, 30 feet from your front property line and 10 everywhere else. And of course, if you got a septic system, there's some, you
Yeah.
can't build over it. But yeah, it's very minimal.
So the difference is most farmers don't, it's not cost-effective to grow indoors like it is for marijuana. So the other question then is, so there's the license, so, obviously farmers don't have to get a license to grow crops, they just grow whatever they want. So this is kind of unique
Yes.
in that this particular crop, you have to get a specific license. Does maybe I missed this, does the license limit the amount of production you can do?
Yes, so that's your little handout here.
Okay.
And this is a summary. So there are other tiers that would allow less. So what what Glenn has given you here is the tier 2. So that's the maximum. So it's the 10,000 per license, 10,000 square feet of indoor mature canopy,
Okay.
40,000 outdoor. It's either or a mix of the two. Yeah.
So I have a question on that subject, tax lot. What if you had a huge warehouse that you subdivided on the inside of it and you had multiple licensees inside there growing? Is that permissible?
I believe so. I think we've seen things like that, I believe, in industrial zones. And I am going to go back and check because someone, I think it was Commissioner Murphy, had a question about that, whether there's a separation requirement. And I'll double check that because I just don't know for sure. But I think as long as you've got some way of showing the OLCC, this is my licensed premises. I mean, they do have requirements. There's security requirement. There are things that the state is regulating regarding your security system, regarding tracking, regarding, your employees and how they're licensed. There's a lot of things that they are implementing. And so they have to have some way of knowing that it's your space. But I don't know if it's as specific as saying it has to be 10 feet.
So you go into a cooperative type environment where all 9 or 10 of us get together and say, we're going to form a cooperative, we're going to get a huge warehouse, and each one of us is going to be a party to that, but we have our own license, then sounds like we're good.
Potentially, and I don't know how we've got situations, I know, where there is a landowner, right? And they have built buildings, and then they have leased those buildings to different licensees. So you could have, as an example, 30 of them, each with their own space. The one I'm aware of, the buildings are detached from one another, the one I'm thinking of, and it's in an EFU district. And each one of those then is separately licensed. But we do not get involved, and I really think it's kind of beyond the scope of what our expertise is to, there are limits. Who can own it? How does all that paperwork work? What makes it one licensee versus if I'm an LLC and then over here, that's just kind of out of the scope of land use. But OLCC would be the ultimate they would determine if you qualified, as you're a separate licensee from Brian, who's a separate, or can you form an LLC and have one license here and then you're an individual? And I think there's some language maybe about how those ownership relationships work, but yeah.
So beyond seeing where we expect them to be on a map, I'd also be curious about the complaints. I can remember one really in-depth complaint where she gave us the calendar with the house on fire. I don't know if you guys remember that, but she had the neighbor who was putting up all the greenhouses, and she was showing what was occurring next to her house, and she was pretty hostile. I'd be curious. I don't need you to show us these are the people who complained, but if you could kind of just show like bubbles of generally like there were complaints over here and complaints with that map of where they're located to see. My fear with this code is currently we've got an urban growth boundary that's been stalled, and you have all these people moving into that use, and they're not going to be able to get that use elsewhere. You know what I mean? So we're going to have, the Damascus Boring area where it's supposed to build out inside we want to make sure we don't leave ourselves with, the first issue of marijuana allowed property becomes what's there. We want to allow for some type of ability to see that land become urban.
So I can find out what kind of data we have on complaints, whether they're tracking. I mean, I know I wouldn't be surprised if they had, at least have some stats on what complaints that have been marijuana-based.
Well, we know
I'll
there's
have to
stuff
check
off of
that.
Beaver Creek, right? We know there's stuff off out in Boring. 'Cause
I
we
mean,
saw
they're all
those people-
over.
Yeah.
We definitely got the map showing where all the licensed, the ones we've approved are, but in terms of linking that up with complaints, I'll have to figure out if the database has those separate, as opposed to any other zoning
Well,
violation.
but it could guide policy, like you're saying, like,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at this. If 80% of the complaints came from one area, what seems to be the issue, that would guide us, would be my thought. So because I don't think we could really do any worse or better, right now. My just worry is what it's like in 20 years based on what we do now. That's the big concern.
Right.
What do you want
So-
to know,
We've got
what type of complaint it was, noise, odor?
My experience coming from Damascus is people who just won't let stuff go, they're the ones to pay attention. You know what I mean? Some people will get used to it. You know what I mean? If there's like one complaint and then it's just the way it is, but if there are people who just keep plugging away, that's where bad policy or good policy can come from if you're careful. So I'm just kind of curious what that looks like.
So we've got a question from Murph and Christine, and then we'll let Jennifer finish up her presentation.
So this may be a question that we already covered, but within an urban growth boundary, these setbacks may be different.
So within an urban growth boundary, the county has a lot of rural zoning inside the urban growth boundary because of the phenomenon of Damascus, where, they were added to the urban growth boundary. We didn't do any planning for it. Then it was a city, then it wasn't a city. It's never had urban zoning applied. Now Happy Valley is starting to move in the direction of planning for some of those areas. They've annexed part of it. They're going to be doing a comprehensive plan. So we will see that start to change. But at the moment, there are actual rural zones inside the UGB. We don't treat those any differently than we do if they're outside the UGB, if they're zoned that way. So if they're EFU zoning inside the UGB, they can do this. Our actual urban zones, so we don't permit commercial type marijuana businesses in any of our urban residential zones. We don't permit it in the residential zones that are unique to the little Mount Hood communities like the HR district or the MRR district. We don't permit it in the 1 and 2 acre zones in our rural areas, so the RA1 and the RA2. So all you can have in those zones is the personal use marijuana. But if you're RFF5, FF10, EFU, then you get the same standards whether in the UGB or outside the UGB. And that was part of when Damascus disincorporated, when we adopted our marijuana regulations, Damascus was a city. So our regulations didn't apply to them. But then when they disincorporated, we applied our ordinance, the board went through a process, had to do that through a hearing, we notified, et cetera, and applied our current ZDO to what had previously been Damascus. And so that included all of the marijuana regulations. So there's no distinction.
Can you go back one slide? Oh,
Maybe. There we go.
there you go. So I just want to clarify and confirm. So what we're talking about would only affect EFU, timber, ag forest zones. And so this whole co-op idea and multiple licensees on a single lot could still absolutely apply for your industrial zones and your RR, FF5, and Farm Forestry 10. Like this change is only for EFU.
Yes, but that's actually because in the RFF5 and FF10, what we have in place now is more restrictive
Oh,
than
right.
anything you would really get from limiting the number of licenses.
That's right.
I guess in theory, and I don't know if we've even seen this, in theory, I suppose somebody could do a 5,000 square foot building and have 2 licensees, but they have to have everything. It's their plant canopy, it's their drawing, it's everything. So it's so minimal that the number of licenses becomes almost a secondary consideration.
So the issue really has developed
Yes.
in this no cap.
Correct. We're
Landscape.
seeing it in the resource zones. That's
Yeah.
correct. And in an industrial zone, the issue there wasn't the multiple, I mean, it is an industrial zone.
Yeah.
That the nature of the development is very similar to what you'd have for other uses. The issue there with capping it at the 20,000 was the board's concerns about economic development and just putting all your eggs in one basket, that we would have this run on industrial land with everybody snapping it up to do marijuana, and we wouldn't have land for other uses. And that's, I think, that's what the concern was there.
One way I think it's helpful to think about it is, 40,000 square feet is kind of the cap, it is the cap for outdoor grows at the state level. It's a little less than a little bit less than an acre. So if you've got one licensee, on a 5-acre piece of EFU land, they can, in theory, fill up about an acre. But as you start getting more and more, you can fill up that entire parcel, and that's kind of what we're dealing with.
That's the concern. So the actual proposal, what's going to be coming to you on November 26th. And to clarify, so the work program that some of you are very familiar with, and others will be even more familiar, when 6 months from now, when we adopt less than that, when we adopt the one for next fiscal year, includes a project. It's a very narrow project. And what it says is we are going to limit the number of production licenses per property. So we're not talking about opening up our marijuana regulations to do 10 other things. You may get testimony about that, and that's fine, but we're not going to have the flexibility to do that. We did go back to the board in a work session recently to verify that they did not want to expand the scope, and the answer was no. They did not want to expand the scope. So we're notifying strictly for this particular limit and just some housekeeping edits that I'll talk to you about in a second, but that are sort of staff-driven. We need to clean this up here and there, but nothing else. We're not talking about new noise standards or new odor standards or, removing this from certain zones or adding it to other zones, or none of that's on the table. So what is the purpose? Yeah.
Maybe you'll get to this, but my question was, what was the origin of only one license versus 2 or 3 licenses, that type of thing?
That's just what made it onto the work program. I think it's potential. I mean, I don't know. It was driven really, I think the board was where how the project initially got on the list, because they're hearing feedback from the community, is my understanding, with concerns. And whether that was, I don't know. I don't know who decided one. I think potentially you could recommend something in between, and I've got a significant issues slide here. We can talk about that, because you can do something, you could recommend something less restrictive than what we notify for, but you can't go say, well, let's prohibit it in RFF5. Well, we can't do that. We didn't, that wasn't proposed.
What's the definition of tract?
A tract is one or more contiguous lots under the same ownership. And that is also a significant issue that we'll talk about in a minute, because that's another place where you might want to change the proposal. So the purpose of the proposal is to limit the scope of marijuana production in the EFU, TBR, and ag forest zones for the reasons that I've described, which is the feeling that maybe this is overly industrial, maybe the scope of the activity going on these sites is unduly burdensome to neighboring property owners. Obviously, there's room for disagreement about that, but that's the reason. That's the purpose. So what would we be doing? We would be amending ZDO 841 to allow only one production license or registration per tract. So the terminology will be slightly different, but essentially, OLCC has licensed premises. You may have one licensed premise on the tract, or you may have one medical marijuana gross site registration, I think is what it's called, per tract. So you pick one or the other, not both, and just one.
Is this prospective?
I'm sorry.
Is this prospective? So people that already have this issue that has been brought to the county commissioners as a concern, do they have to untangle all their licenses?
It's a very interesting question. You're ahead of me, but we don't know. No, it's totally fine. It's a huge issue. And I think you're going to get a ton of testimony about that. And so, yes, we need to talk about that. And if it's okay, I just want to hold off just a minute, and I'll circle back to that in just a second. So additional minor edits. Some of this is in the name of the famous ZDO audit, because we haven't audited Section 841, but we've audited virtually every other 800 section. So there will be a little bit of just sort of like removing, there's a section that shows applicability. That's not in the 800s anymore. It's in the underlying zone, so that comes out. So that's what I mean by consistency with other 800 series ZDO sections. Standardizing the access provisions. There's an access restriction, which says that if your marijuana business is using a private, and again, this is just in the natural resource and rural residential zones, so we're only talking about production and in some cases processing, because you can't retail or wholesale from these zones. If you're sharing a private access, then the other people who use that access have to consent to the business. It's the same language that we have for home occupations, and we're standardizing that language across all the places where it appears. We're correcting our references to licensed engineers. We did not realize that the state of Oregon just licenses engineers. They don't license specialties, and Stephen is nodding his head. So we have this, licensed acoustical engineer, there's no such thing. So we're stripping out those specific references, and it's just a licensed engineer. Changing yard depth to setback, because we're doing that everywhere. And clarifying our noise standards. There was a sentence structure issue where the way we listed the different types of equipment that was subject to the noise standard, maybe there was some room for questioning. So it's really just, hey, this is kind of this collection of housekeeping things that we need to take care of.
How do you enforce the charcoal filter requirement? There's an annual change on that minimum?
It's no, I mean, we don't go out and inspect. So there is a requirement, and it's a condition of approval. And so as with everything land use, we are complaint driven. So when we get a complaint, we go out and investigate. And I know that code enforcement has done that for, I believe, odor and definitely for noise, probably for lighting. We do get complaints and then we go out and, yeah. But it's not, there's no automatic like annual inspection or anything of these sites. The board's talked about that, maybe through some sort of a business license, but I don't know where that's headed.
All right, so it says in here that you got to change it annually.
Yep.
You just get them to agree that that's definitely older than a year, and that's why we have an odor problem?
I guess I'd have to ask. I mean, I suppose they could present receipts or something. I don't know what the standard that code enforcement would do to prove that that was the case, whether you can tell if they're dirty, whether you can, say, well, show me your receipt for the filter that you purchased. Yeah. But again, I don't know. Maybe we may be able to find that out from code enforcement. So significant issues, and you guys are already all way ahead of the game because you've asked all the questions already, which is great, about what these issues are. So the first one is the effect of the amendments on previously approved or implemented marijuana production uses. And I'm sure that there are going to be some concerned folks out there because they've already got a land use approval. And there are sort of two different categories that someone could be in. They could have gotten a land use approval from us, gotten a license from the state, and begun operating. That's number one. It's implemented effectively. Secondly, they could have gotten the approval, but they haven't actually started running their business yet. So for example, right now, OLCC is not taking new license applications. They've got this huge backlog. They've shut the gates, basically. They're catching up on whatever, a year or 2 years worth of, I'm not sure. I think they're thinking it's going to take maybe a year to process them all. So you really can't get, if you're not already in the queue, you can't get a license. So there could be some people who've gotten approval from us, but either because they can't file with the state or because they're waiting for the state to process their application or because they just haven't gotten around to it or who knows. So you're going to have people, and then you're going to have people, really there's more than two because there's all the people who are in between. They've partially implemented, but not completely implemented. Maybe they thought they were going to have 7 licenses and they've only got 2. So what does that mean moving forward? And I want to be very careful because these questions are, in some cases, going to be very site-specific. And we're not going to be able to sit here and assure people that there's no impact on them. And I think we need to be very careful not to. What we can say is that as a general premise, if you have a land use that was lawfully established and the local government or the state government changes the rules on you, you are allowed to continue operating that business. We do not expect that marijuana will be treated any differently. You just have this kind of asterisk out here which says, yeah, but it's not legal under federal law. What if the state changes things? What if OLCC says, well, you can revoke licenses because this is different? We can't predict any of that for people. And that uncertainty has been there from the beginning. This isn't really changing that.
Are there any special provisions for how the licensees prove that they have a lawfully existing business going forward?
So they can do, our code has a section on nonconforming uses, which is routinely used for other, over the years, other types of nonconforming uses. We would anticipate that they could use that same, we expect they can use the same mechanism. So they are allowed to do what's called a verification. It's important to note, first of all, though, they're not obligated to do that. So when the government changes the rules, for instance, you used to be able to build a house on every piece of property in Clackamas County in whatever, the 60s. Now, when we came in and said, oh, but in EFU, you can't build houses unless you meet these rules, we didn't go out and tell everybody who had a pre-existing dwelling, you've got to come in here and justify to the county that it's legal. And again, I don't expect that this would be any different. Where verifications typically come up is where the applicant or the property owner wants to verify for their own purposes, either because they're getting ready to sell the property, because they're doing some sort of financing, because they're gonna, for whatever reason, they may want just for their own peace of mind to do a verification. So there's a process for that. It's a land use application, notice to neighbors, appeal, all of the usual things that we would expect from that type of process. It's a type 2 review. Sometimes we require verifications as part of code enforcement. So if you have a situation where something's come to our attention and somebody's saying, oh, they hauled this mobile home out there and it's not legal, and the applicant's saying, no, really, it's been here since the 60s, and we're trying to look at aerial photos and tax assessor information, and it's murky or something, we could, in order to resolve a code enforcement case, require them to do a verification. At which point they can submit all the information that they have. Now, in this case, should be very easy for us to determine, because these uses have all been, at least if you're recreational, it wasn't legal until January 4th of 2016. So it does become a fairly simple factual exercise in that you have to have gotten a permit from the county, or you can't come in and claim it was legal because you needed a permit. So there's that, and then licensing through the state should be able to be verified. Did they not get a license? Have they renewed it? How long have they, I think that should be relatively simple to determine what their level of licensure is. I suppose the difficulty would be, well, so they got all these licenses, but how do we know what's actually been implemented? And then it's a question of, well, did they do permitting? Do we have plumbing permits, electrical permits, mechanical permits? Did the state do an inspection as part of their license? And I think it'll be a paperwork exercise of gathering all that up if there's a question.
Well, you have to exercise that permit within a year, if I remember right. Didn't I see that in 841?
So they have 4 years to actually have 4 years to implement,
4
which is
years,
fairly
okay.
standard. It's a different on the retail side, but for what we're talking about, they have 4 years to implement. Yeah. So
So do we have any idea how many locations in the county involve multiple licensees on a piece of property? We
no,
just don't know.
we're going to try to gather that information. I can't promise, but we're going to do our best before the 26th.
Even a
to try
guess
to-
would be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
we're
to
gonna
understand how
try to estimate.
widespread
Yeah.
this issue is.
Yes, exactly. So what's interesting, so that, I feel like that's almost the more straightforward piece, they've already implemented. And our position now would be, well, then you have a non-conforming use for whatever you've already implemented. If you have 3 licenses and that's all on the up and up, and we gave you approval for that, and you've got your land use compatibility statements, and you're, okay, then that's a non-conforming use. Barring, like I say, all these exceptions of what might happen if the law changes at the state level or federal or whatever. But what if you got a land use approval, but you haven't implemented, but you have 4 years to implement? It's a little bit murkier, but our operating assumption right now is the land use decision doesn't protect you from the change in state law. So that if you have not implemented, that's unfortunate. You'd be at 1 license at that point. You could potentially argue what's called a vested right, which is slightly different than a non-conforming use, where you argue, well, I didn't actually finish, but I've done such an investment in this. I've been working toward this for 2 years. I've got tens of thousands of dollars into getting this property ready for this. You sort of can't rip the rug out from under me. And vested rights are a creature of case law. I can't point you to something in the code that tells you what the criteria are. There is a famous case, it's Clackamas County case, that has various factors that I cannot quote off the top of my head, but generally it does look at how much you've invested, like what your total investment was expected to be and how much you've spent toward that. It's like, if you've spent something like, I think the case was maybe like they'd spent 14% of what they,
Wouldn't it make sense to get ahead of that and just qualify like the definition, like a vested right form? Provide this to show, given that you're going to have this and it won't come out till, and
Yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity to that probably goes beyond marijuana.
well, it's the elements of what is a vested right before a court. And what you're saying is we won't challenge you, taking you to court to challenge this if you rise above this, is what the county would be saying, right? So if you do this, our lawyer said, we're not going to sue. You know what I mean? That's what you would be
Yeah.
saying with it.
I'm sorry, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, you're setting a high standard. You know what I mean? It'd be reasonable.
I was just,
yeah.
from a practical standpoint though, right? What's gonna happen here is that you've got an existing use, there's gonna have to be a complaint. The county's then gonna have to decide whether or not to enforce it.
Correct.
And if the county enforces it and the licensee objects, then they'll end up suing over it. Maybe we'll get some case law, but I don't think anything's gonna happen unless someone actually complains and the county undertakes an enforcement action on a particular
So
non-conforming use.
there's different ways this could come to us. So generally, I feel like I don't have any reason to believe that the paperwork trail between the state and the county isn't fully functional. I'm not saying nothing's ever been missed, but generally speaking, I think we're signing land use compatibility statements for license applications. Like there's a paperwork trail for what has
Right.
happened and what hasn't happened. And between the state and the county, we'll know what was and wasn't approved. So I think the question's gonna be more, well, okay, so we signed this land use compatibility statement and then you got your license, but did you really start, or you applied for your license, but it's not really issued yet. There's gonna be a bunch of different fact circumstances. And I don't know that it's so much suing. I mean, I guess anybody can sue anybody for anything, but there's a land use process. They can file for a vested right. It's just case law, but they can file with the county a vested right application. And we did that with major 37/49 claims. We've done vested rights in recent years. So we do have people on staff who know how that works. Obviously, our lawyer also knows how that works. So they can do that. Or if it's a nonconforming use, they can file for verification of the nonconforming use. And then there's a second option, which is I have a nonconforming use. I have 3 licenses. Now I want my 4th license. That's an alteration of a nonconforming use. So once you're nonconforming, you are permitted to apply to alter that use. It is not automatically approved, and we can look at whether the impacts of that 4th license are greater and whether than the existing use, and whether those impacts can be mitigated. But that's available to anybody who's got a nonconforming use today, and that would continue to be available.
Non-conforming use extinguishes if they go 6 months without using it.
A year.
A
1
year, 12 months, okay.
Yes.
So we don't have any worries of them in agriculture missing 6 months or anything like that.
Yeah,
It's
1 year.
clearly a year.
Yeah, I guess my initial point was that, assuming someone just wants to continue doing what they're currently doing, it's gonna take a complaint to actually bring that to the forefront, right?
Yeah, I think so, and I don't know. I think the complaints are likely to be more about the impacts than that they've somehow illegally got a 4th license we didn't know about.
license, right,
Yeah, I think it's gonna
right.
be more about, and so then I guess the question would be, I suppose, in the course of that, we might find, well, you have 4 licenses, but you really weren't operating until, I guess those things could come up if the neighbors were to say, well, yes, they have 4 licenses, but they really weren't operational. So in that context, it would be a code enforcement process that would lead to that, yes.
So I have a general question. So if it is all if it is all complaint driven, then how much of an impact will this actually make in resolving whatever the concern is that the county has brought this to the planning commission to review in the first place? And I'm wondering why, once this is approved and moved through the complete process, why information wouldn't go out to all of these licensees to let them know if they're on this side of it, they might be a non-conforming use, they ought to check in. If they're on this side of it, like no matter who they are,
Right.
if they have multiple licenses on a single track, they should probably determine where they are in relation to this new ordinance. So like, why wouldn't there be some sort of there is proactive notification, I'm assuming, so everybody knows the new rules?
So potentially that could be done. Is that routinely done? No. Your point is well taken. It might make sense. There is notification. There is, I guess you would call proactive notification. We are doing property owner notice, which is legally required.
Right now.
For,
Yeah.
yes, which is going out in week after next, or next week, I guess.
Which means they'll probably all be here on the 26th.
Right.
I mean, I think that the issue there is that it's the landowner who gets notified. So if they are leasing, it's a question of whether, I would assume most landowners, if they're leasing to people, are gonna be concerned about this, but they would have to share that information. If they have 30 lessees or whatever, we're notifying the landowner. So in terms of reaching out, sure, we could generate a mailing list from everybody who's submitted an application potentially over time and let them know that this has happened. And that's, something we could consider
This
doing.
is just a potential substantial change to somebody's business model.
Absolutely.
There's economic issues at play here. I would think that going to the next step to communicate would seem like it could kind of tamp down people's concerns as far as responsiveness and process and things like that.
What
Yes.
about like performance thresholds set within those 4 years, where you have to, after 1 year, you have to have a certain amount of work done toward that goal of your production. 2 years, you have to be at this point. 3 years, you have to be at this point.
I mean, it's not to say you couldn't do something like that. I don't know. I think the thing that concerns me is we're talking about this in the context of marijuana, but the idea of when permits expire and how you renew those and not what is a nonconforming use and vested rights is much bigger than marijuana. So we wouldn't be codifying, I can't see us codifying some special vested right something just for marijuana. It becomes this like much larger issue, and I don't know what our land use attorney would say about the odds of being able to codify a vested right, because I think part of the issue is that there was no such thing really. I mean, we didn't have a vested right in our code. The court said, well, this person's done enough. The next court might say this guy's done enough, even if we try to say it isn't enough. And I think that's sort of the concern, is that it's very unique to each individual set of circumstances. And even if we tried to codify it, I don't know that we successfully could. But I've never done any sort of research to know whether there are other jurisdictions that have tried or how that has worked.
Well, building permits have expiration dates, right? I mean,
Sure.
you have to have a certain amount of inspections within
Yes.
a given time.
Yes, and we have an implementation standard that says within 4 years you have to do X. And it's not a very high burden for most of our permits. Like with a subdivision, you got to record the plat. But with things like design review, conditional uses, it's like you have to get a major development permit issued. So like your building permit for your grocery store, for example, or, and it varies depending upon, because some of the applications are pretty minor in the first place, so there's not a lot they really have to do in order to implement. So they're a little bit geared to whatever type of permit it is. But we do have implementation standards, and then they can typically do a 2-year extent, in most cases a 2-year extension if they don't meet that time frame. And the idea behind having them expire is certainty for neighbors. So 20 years from now, we used to have permits that never expired. So 20 years from now, somebody buys a piece of property and doesn't realize that somebody had a conditional use permit from for something from 20 years previously, and they had no, I think that's kind of the idea, is just, and because rules change. And so as you move forward and community standards are different, how long should you have to kind of be thinking, oh, something that's now inconsistent with what we would allow today still might go in. But what we came up with was 4 years with a 2-year extension for most of our permits.
But to Jennifer's kind of overall primary point, and correct me if I'm wrong, I
Yeah.
think we should be approaching this as if what we do is not going to affect any existing use as long as they continue doing what they are currently doing. What we're doing is affecting future permits and making a decision, about those future permits.
That's not what I heard.
So I
entirely.
think there's two things. I think I think we have to be careful about assuming anything. But I think it is relatively safe to assume that if they have implemented their use, so there's a farm out there that has 27 licenses up and running, that this is not going to change, as far as we know, not going to change their operation. They can continue to run those 27 businesses. If they come in for number 28, they may not get it, even if their original application suggested they wanted 50. I think that puts them in a questionable position, because then you're into this, well, you have this approval, but are you really vested at this point to do 50? Maybe not, but maybe so. And that becomes this vested right question.
What
And then,
information is on those applications for when they get the county land use approval? What have they given you?
What information? Is that
Yeah,
you
what
said?
information, what's in their plans? How far into the process are they?
So when they give us their application, that is also going to be something somewhat difficult to administer, because we weren't asking them how many licenses they were going to get. We didn't care. Up until now, we haven't cared. So what we need enough information to be able to implement our standards, which are just not really geared to the amount of canopy, the number of plants, the number of licenses. It's things like, do you meet the setbacks? What's your lighting plan? And a lot of it is really just an exercise, because the standards are intended to be clear and objective. And so essentially we're just saying, you have to meet these requirements. You have to submit a noise study. You have to submit an odor study. You have to install this kind of filtration or an acceptable, something your engineer says is equally good. And so that will potentially pose some challenges if people want to essentially claim that they're vested to finish something, and we can't even figure out how many licenses they ever thought they were going to get. But I think in the end, some of them have said, And some of them have just shown canopy area, right? Like, we're gonna do outdoor production on these 5 acres, or we're gonna have this building, or we're gonna have these 10 buildings. And I think you'll find quite a bit of difference from application to application about how specific they were in terms of the number of individual businesses they would have. However, because there are these limits that we talked about, if we look at an application and it's clear they thought they were gonna have 50,000 square feet of indoor canopy, then it's pretty obvious they intended to have more than one license, because the state wouldn't have permitted them to have that much canopy for only one. I think some of it will be working back, kind of a backwards mathematical exercise to figure out how many licenses they kind of thought they were gonna get. But again, if they don't already have them, then we're still gonna have that question of, okay, you're here now to get number 4 or number 10, can you? And, at this point, I think the answer is you only can if you're vested. So we are creating, it's just a fact, however 200, 300, however many there are, non-conforming use / potentially stopping their business plan at a certain point unless they can demonstrate that they're vested. And I think it is going to be a challenge for those people, and it's going to be an administrative challenge for our department.
But it's not going to be a challenge if you create what qualifies as evidence.
Well, I don't think it's so much as creating what qualifies as, I mean, I think,
I think you clearly are describing that you're having trouble wrapping your brain about where you're going to make the decision on a bright line. And as a member of the board who's in a business who's dealt with non-conforming use issues that
right.
just go on and they get crazy, and here's a picture of the sign in 1980 before this was inside the city of Portland. Well, we can't take that at face value, right? Like, create a bright line right now. And if they really have a problem with it, you should be able to go, do you have leases? Do you have people who you can show an executed document that shows that they had an expectation for what you were doing? Do you have a business plan that you can show backdated that was the plan? Like, there are things that they could provide as evidence that a judge would ask for that you can ask your lawyer. What would you want to see if you were a judge? Ask for those now. And by putting that out there as like just a simple fact sheet that wouldn't even be in the code, you'd probably save us all. Because that's what I'd be looking for, is just give me a clear thing to do. All right, that goes in the file. 2 years from now, if there's a question, I know I'm good. 2 years from now, that guy might have forgot the meeting, right? Because he's living, So I just ask for that.
So I think there's a difference between saying that the county could provide some kind of administrative guidance to people, depending upon what's exactly adopted, that would help them navigate our system. We do that all the time, and I don't think that's an issue. We provide advice all the time, and we would on a vested right. We can tell them these are the 7 factors that are considered. I'm making up 7, but whatever it is, these are the factors. This is how we evaluate these. But I don't know, and I guess this will be a question. Our attorney intends to be here on the 26th, and I encourage you to pose this question. I don't know that we can decide what a nonconforming use is. I mean, state law creates essentially what a nonconforming use is and how you can alter that. And
I'm
for us
not
to
saying that you decide that. You say
No.
that you would look for these types of evidence that
Sure.
you should have to put them on notice now, so that if the question raises like, all right, I heard you,
Sure.
I'm in good shape, then 3 years from now, all of a sudden,
Right.
the world, just like, hey, at this time at this meeting, I put together this evidence. So as a business owner who's had to basically to go through heck and pay consultants and architects to prove something that's obvious multiple times in my life, just if you create, like, if you
Right.
ask the lawyer what we should look for evidence and you put it to them, it makes it pretty clear if they try to backdate stuff that it wasn't there.
And we could do that, what type of evidence we would be looking for. The issue is we can't guarantee that that will be sufficient, because in the end, it's a discretionary call and it's appealable by neighbors and everyone else. And we can't undo that. So we can't guarantee, but we can certainly tell them, we'd be looking at licenses that have been issued and receipts for the money you spent and, all of those kinds of things.
And I
Yeah.
think if we move forward with the extra noticing that Christine was recommending, that might be something that could be included. So for,
Right.
this type of conditions,
Yes.
there's a gray area. The kind of documentation you could need is including
Correct.
but not limited to, that
Yes.
kind of thing.
Yes, so that they keep
So
those
it's a
kinds of
handout, it's not
records.
codified, but it's part of the heads
Right.
up. You might want to be
Yeah.
holding on to this kind of information.
If you're not currently in operation or you have plans and given you're gonna need to document to prove where you are in this place if challenged.
Yeah.
Right.
Because these are all still basically very new businesses.
Yes,
So you would think this would be the time to put them in a good position if they did want to move forward.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that if this whole issue came to light because there are complaints from neighbors or whatever, it came to this situation for a reason. Therefore, those folks who have the multiple licenses and they're going to basically do the non-conforming of the vest or whatever and continue, and this will only apply for the new licensees, then how is it really addressing the complaints?
It's not. I mean, I think that's clearly the case. And that's true with land use, that we don't, I mean, cities have a little more flexibility than counties do because of the way state law works. But people who establish uses are protected. We're not able to, whether you think that's good or bad, not able to essentially pull the rug out from under them and say, well, sorry, you have to close your business tomorrow or tear down your house because it's not allowed in the zone. Yeah, so it's true. It's only really moving ahead. But it also might prevent, and that's what we're saying, some of the people who are in between may not be able, and I think that, as you've aptly pointed out, that may prevent some of the complaints, but it also raises some fairness questions for the people who are investing in these businesses, and that's why this whole conversation is so sticky. And I anticipate that it will be.
Let's move on.
Yes,
Finish
okay.
up. Yeah.
So the other significant issue, not quite such a significant issue, but something for you to think about, is how should this limit be applied? And somebody kind of already raised that question. Why one per tract? Honestly, because that's about the most restrictive, and we thought, let's notify for that. And if you decide you want to ratchet it back and not go that restrictive, then you can do that, as opposed to getting out there after we've done the notice and somebody saying, oh, I want to be more restrictive. So we notified per tract, contiguous lots in the same ownership.
I have a question on
yeah.
that. What's the difference between a tax lot and a tract?
So a tax lot is a creature of the assessor. It means very little in terms of land use, which is extremely confusing for the public and everyone else. The tax assessor will create tax lots for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes because you have a mortgage on 1 acre of your 80-acre farm tract and they need to carve that out in case the bank has to foreclose. Foreclosure would make that legal, but up until then, it's just a mortgage lot. It's not. So it's a tax lot for purposes of getting your statement that we're all probably getting right now from our assessors. But it doesn't mean anything in terms of land use. So in our code, they're often the same, but not always. And so in our code, we have what we call lots of record. And that's kind of a complicated creature of the zoning code. But what it basically, a lot of record is if it's a platted subdivision lot or a platted parcel in a partition, or if it was lawfully created, now you have to do a partition or a subdivision in order to create lots, but you didn't always have to. So if the lot was lawfully created through a deed or, I believe, contract purchase, then it might be a separate lot of record. But if they were under the same ownership and it did not meet the minimum lot size at the time the first zone was applied to the property, they're combined. So you could have somebody who had two separately deeded, let's say 5-acre parcels under the same ownership, and their first zoning was 10-acre minimum, so neither of those lots met the minimum, they're combined. And that's been the way our code has worked since, I mean, more or less forever. So yes, we have to do research in some cases to determine whether things are a lot of record. And the reason a lot of record is significant is because, in particular, it comes up for dwellings, that the lot's not buildable if it's not a lot of record for a single-family dwelling.
So how does your definition here of tract and OLCC's definition of a tax lot, it seems, it's very confusing to me
Yes.
to understand that.
Yes.
OLCC has adopted a tax lot, and we're talking about a tract. So how do we merge those two together?
Right, right. So we wouldn't really. We would be applying our standard, and we see this fairly often because state agencies don't have any reason, because they're regulating for different reasons. They don't care about sort of the same things that we care about. They're not worried about whether you're creating 2-acre lots in a 10-acre zone illegally, or, that's, in this case, they just want to license the marijuana to meet state regulations, which are geared at much different things than what the zoning code is geared at. So we would have to be independently doing the research on whether they had a tract. We do that for some other types of land use, but it won't sync up. So the state really only cares, I guess, if they have a tax lot. Well, they can go down tomorrow and take their 40-acre parcel and create 40 tax lots, and the assessor will give them 40 tax statements. And it does not mean that that was a lawful division. I think it's unfortunate it works that way. There's reasons why it does, and there's some good reasons why it does, but it can cause a lot of confusion for the public. And this won't obviously remedy that. But from our perspective, what we'll do if somebody comes in, files an application for a brand-new marijuana production business, they might file on everything they own, but they might not. So regardless, we'll have to check the ownership of everything that abuts that particular property. And then we would have to condition it at that point and saying, the other thing about tracts, though, is that because they are aggregations of multiple lots of record, you can get around the tract provision. It's not like it's hard and fast, like once a tract, always a tract. So even though tract is more restrictive than lot of record, in the end, they could potentially choose to transfer the ownership of one of those lots. They could literally sell it to somebody. They could put it in their wife's name, their son's name, an LLC. I mean, there's ways to sort of deal with that question, which is one reason we thought about not doing tract, because we're thinking, well, it's just a hoop potentially that people will have to jump through. And so, but again, we went back and forth and decided, let's do it because it's the most restrictive, and then you guys can decide whether you like that or not. So alternatively, we could do per lot of record, which is where it is a legal unit of land under zoning, essentially. It can be developed separately. Or we could, so if somebody happened to own 5 10-acre EFU parcels and they're all separate lots of record, they could have 5 licenses if we went with lot of record. And then based on an acreage standard would be the alternative. Because we've sort of kicked it around at the staff level thinking, well, does it make sense that if I have 100 acres of EFU, I get 1 license? And if I have 2 acres of EFU, I get 1 license? Is that logical? Does it really deal with the impacts we're worried about? On the flip side, an acreage standard will be harder to administer. And the question would be, well, let's say you take that 100-acre piece of EFU and you say, well, we're going to let them have 1 license per 10, let's just say. So they get 10, but do they have to put them, what if they want to put them all together and it really looks like an industrial, or are we going to make them space them all out over the property, which might be a really bad use of farmland? So there's some reasons not to use an acreage standard, but you just have to recognize
Which would be easiest for you to administer?
to administer. The easiest one to administer would be lot of record. That's the easiest to administer.
Is there
It doesn't make it the
is there
fairest,
any
I don't know.
difficulty for any landowner who might refinance if they have a property that's licensed for marijuana production, but they're trying to get a federal loan or of any type?
I don't know. I think there's some issues because, it's my understanding, and I haven't tracked this at all, but there's some significant issues because marijuana is not legal federally.
Correct.
So I think there are some problems that we simply don't get
Just
involved
concerned
in.
about the unexpected consequences.
Yeah, in terms of financing and stuff like that, there can be some problems, I think.
I would
For
think-
other uses that are limited per property, how are those typically classified in the zoning ordinance? So if there's something else that's limited by a property, is it typically done by tract, lot of record? How are other uses?
Both.
tracked?
Both, all of the above. Yeah, we're not consistent. So a lot of things are a lot of record because we do kind of consider that our minimum size to be able to develop something. So dwellings are the ones that come up the most often, right? And so a lot of record is almost always what we use. But the tract comes up in these same zones, the EFU, the TBR, and the ag forest, and that's because that's the way the state geared some of their dwelling standards, and we just have to implement those. And so they do look at contiguous holdings, and there's some theory behind that because I think it's sort of this trade-off of we're trying to protect farm and forest land, but we want to let the farmer have a dwelling, or we want to so there are limitations where you can only get 1 dwelling per tract in some cases. And I think it was trying to balance that sort of, well, we'll give them a house, but we're not going to let them have 1 house on 10 different lots when it's in one of these zones.
It strikes me that there's 2 major implications, or 2 major implications of this that we're trying to regulate, right? One is the percentage of the parcel that's covered by a grow, and the other is the level of activity that's created by the number of licensees. And I think the question is which of these options best regulates those 2 impacts, right?
Correct. Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. And I think we've heard sort of just, this is very anecdotal, but kind of 2 different things, and they get at the 2 different things you said. One being, yes, that level of activity, people complaining because there's people coming and going at all hours, and it's not so much the stuff we're regulating through the marijuana regulations. It's not the noise of the generators. It's not, I mean, not that
It's
they
the
don't care
traffic.
about that.
People
but
coming
it's
in
the
and out, right?
Employees
Yeah.
coming and going, or the security guard coming and go, whatever it is. And it's car doors slamming and voices and music and, headlights and those kinds of things, which are not remotely regulated through what we would typically think of as land use regulations. It's just sort of that activity that happens. And that, I think, is a function of, yes, the number of licenses, although I suppose dispersing on the property might, mitigate some of that. And then the other one being, yes, this industrial appearance, which kind of gets at your question. Not so much how many outdoor acres of marijuana we have, it's the buildings, the sort of industrial feel to having all those buildings lined up.
Jennifer, you're also looking at, you're gonna have to access those lots somehow. So this means your feeder road is gonna change its designation. If you have 20 different lots lined up or licensees on 100 acres, you're gonna have to put a road in that can withstand that that a fire truck can go down along with public utility that's going down it.
Yeah,
So-
potentially. And I mean, I think there are some, when I think about trying to impose a requirement that says you have to space these out on large pieces of property, I do get worried that there's a lot of unintended consequences with that we probably don't want to go down that road. For all those reasons. It's like, okay, so now we're then incentivizing people to build these really long driveways or to run these utility lines way out there or to use up their good farmland or harvest their trees in order to, and I wouldn't want to inadvertently be,
I've
forcing that.
physically seen it, not in this county,
Yeah,
and where it was, they took 20 acres and divided it into 2-acre parcels and created different
Right.
row lots,
sure.
and it was a mess.
If they're putting up greenhouses, I mean, that permanently impacts the use of the farmland. I remember what we did with the solar panels, that we had to make sure that they return the land to its ag use. There's no requirements on this with marijuana at all because it's agricultural use, correct?
Yeah, buildings used for farm uses are incorporated into the definition of farm use at the state level. So things like greenhouses or other agriculture, barns for livestock, those are all absolutely fair game. Dairy barns, I mean, yes.
Do you
there's
think it'd be
elements.
reasonable to request a plan to return the farmland to its original state if the marijuana use discontinues?
I don't know if that's a reasonable regulation. I mean, it's,
I don't know how you'd make it
Clearly
happen
dramatically
either,
different
But I'm
than-
just thinking of the woman, like, look at all the construction next to my house. You remember that? Like, it just, for those who didn't see it, like, she lived next to a farm property. Now she lives next to a bunch of greenhouses that blow the smell marijuana at her.
and I have some
yeah.
concerns about just moving down the road. So in 20 years, they're not growing marijuana anymore and the county goes out there and starts compelling people to demolish buildings. I'm not saying they couldn't do it.
I don't want that either. I'm just
Interesting.
kind of thinking
Yeah.
a step ahead.
Yeah.
I think the gold rush is passing us by, so you're going to see like a consolidation. But I just kind of wonder about that, like the trouble we put, like you have that marginal farmland and what they had to go through to put solar panels on it to sell it to a utility that wanted the power. It's just kind of weird that they could build all these buildings without even a consideration.
Well, I
and
think the difference
aggregate
is-
has to remediate, right? When they were done, wasn't that the
What was
aggregate?
that? Yes,
Aggregate has to.
yes. And I think the distinction is this: marijuana is a farm use.
Right.
Solar panels aren't, and aggregate mines aren't. Whether we agree that it is or isn't, is it really more industrial than it is farming? I don't know. But as
Well,
far as the way the state treats it.
It's a farm
that's
use,
the case.
but you have reasonable, you know what I mean?
Yes, we have
You
more
have that
authority.
reasonability.
Yes.
So, I just think like you have no permitting rules that you have over farm buildings at all, right?
Correct.
They're their own deal.
For building, that's correct.
I'm gonna let it go. It just kind of gets me thinking like, if you have tract, you've now rendered that agricultural use no longer agricultural use. The buildings are there. What comes after that,
Yeah, I don't know.
So,
So
I have
this
a
is my
quick-
last slide.
Yeah, I have a quick comment then, Mary. I was just, my comment was, this is all an interesting discussion, but at the end of the day, the only thing that's been noticed here is the change of potential licensees.
Correct.
So nothing else, the setbacks are still the same.
Yes.
Everything's going to be regulated exactly the way it is now. The question is how many individuals are going to be on a tax.
but the
And
licensee
yes.
number goes to the number of buildings.
I mean, I think potentially,
necessarily.
yes, I think potentially you would have the ability under the notice, if we notified one per tract. So if you were to come to the conclusion, well, we want to do one per lot of record, that's fine because it's less restrictive. We're going to do one per 10 acres, less restrictive, or one per lot of record, or if your lot of record is bigger than 10 acres, one per 10 acre. You know, those things I think are within your purview. In theory, if you wanted to have a standard that said, well, normally it's one license, but we'll let you have two if, and you wanted to have some standards. These are all type 1 reviews, so they need to be clear and objective standards. But you could potentially do something like that if you felt like, you know, as long as you separate the buildings by 50 feet, as long as you know, you could try to craft those types of standards if that's where you end up on this discussion. As long as it's within we're just talking about the number of production licenses.
With the goal of this to be reduce the number of complaints.
I suppose, although, yeah, I mean, I think complaints as, if we think of complaints as being representative of community concerns, I think that the board is responsive to the sense that the public is not happy about these industrial marijuana businesses. Now, how much of the public, you know, again, it's not a scientific analysis, it's just we're hearing it.
I think that's the genesis of it, right? But our goal is to regulate the land use impacts that could potentially arise from multiple licensees. And I think we have to decide what those impacts are and whether this is an appropriate way to regulate that, right? The county commission is, responding to complaints, and I think we look at it from a land use perspective and take that approach. Does that make any sense? Mary?
That actually leads into my comment. So it sounds like when we're taking the land use perspective, from what we're hearing, the issue is when how they're using the land with these multiple buildings together starts to turn more industrial rather than agricultural.
Yes.
So what we should be thinking about when we're talking about how we want to limit is there a way to identify a potential spot where that is? So maybe it's more of a combination of, a certain number per acre up to a maximum number, which when you see this many together, it creates a more industrial environment than farm environment kind of thing.
And can we separate the outdoor and the indoor? In other words, can we make two different standards?
Yes? Potentially you
I guess
could,
the question I would have is, so there are large greenhouse complexes in Oregon as well. I'd be curious to know how big those facilities are and how those might compare with where the marijuana industry is headed.
And if they have multiple tenants in them, so it's
I mean, theoretically, they're not
comparable
limited-
use
they're not
wise,
limited
because
how many
it's-
greenhouses they can put on a property if they want to grow flowers or whatever it is they want to produce. But it seems to me, if I was a marijuana owner, I'd be pointing at them and say, well, wait a minute, look at that site over there. They've got, their whole property is greenhouses. Why am I not able to do that? I just want to be prepared to.
yeah, and
understand that distinction.
I don't know that we'll be able to get that data. I guess I think the way to, because again, we'd be driving around trying to find, I don't know, maybe there'd be some industry research somewhere. We don't permit any of that stuff from a land use standpoint, so we don't track it. My thought is there's less, I think you would find some farms that have a lot of buildings on them for the reason you're talking about, because it's whatever, it's dairy barns or it's, greenhouses or whatnot. What you don't have is the motivation to have so many farmers on one piece of property, because nobody's telling you can only grow so many square feet of orchids or so many square feet, you can only have so many cows or you can, so I think this creature of, well, you can only have X amount of canopy creates a situation where people are inclined to lease to a whole bunch of people. Whether that means what impacts, maybe it's not the overall building, maybe it's that there's 30 little ones all lined up next to each other as opposed to one enormous dairy barn that people would be used to seeing. I don't know. I'll have to see if we can get some pictures. I don't know what we've got exactly to give you a sense of sort of what we're talking about. And what the kind of concern, I guess, is from folks. I think there's also a reality that part of this is because it's marijuana. I mean, regardless of all these other impacts, that's still there, that people don't like it because it's marijuana, and we have to at least keep that in the back of our minds.
Well,
that's
yeah,
part of
I
the
mean,
issue.
I get that piece of it.
Yeah.
But I'm just, it's kind of it's an interesting challenge because of the OLCC restrictions, creating this unintended consequences. Because I don't think they were thinking people would get creative.
Yeah. Yeah,
They were thinking, okay, this will help limit them out and
right. Yeah.
anyway.
Well, I made a note. I don't know what we can get in regard to that, but I'm trying to keep track of, and I'll do what I can for all of
And
this
if you
that you're
can
asking for.
try to bring, again, the data, the feedback on the complaints of the outdoor versus the indoor. In other words, is most of this
Yeah.
lots and lots of buildings and all these licensees, or is it big outdoor land use, but in little sections based on all these licensees?
Yeah.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
Seeing it's
Try to see.
indoor.
With the impact being more on the larger properties and potentially having somebody who says, oh, I pre-built to have 50 licenses, I think I'm going to be interested to learn more about the shared access road, which you listed as a minor issue, because if somebody has 24, but they did infrastructure for 50 licenses, and now they have to get approval of their neighbor to go to the 26th license, because you listed
Oh.
as a minor.
Right, no, so just to clarify, there's already a requirement in the code that if you're on a private road, you have to get permission from your, yeah, that's not changing.
And is that-
All we're doing is essentially streamlining the actual standard. There was a bunch of language in it that we realized was extraneous, and we stripped it out of the home occupation code during the audit, and now we're just trying to sync it up. But you will, they currently have to get a signature from everyone who shares that road, and that's not proposed to be changing.
And I'd like to get it just so I can read it, because I'd like to know, is it
The
from-
standard?
Yeah, as far as, is it from this property to the county road, or is it the people that are actually further back than that piece of
So
property?
if you do you have 841 in your?
Yeah, I
So if
read
you've
it.
got I think it's in your packet there that Darcy left on the desk.
Yep.
So the standard is, it's repeated a couple times because it applies to production and processing, but you can find it on page 3, 841-3, in the middle of the page, it says access.
Access, yep.
And this is the current language. When you get your draft in your next packet, you'll see that this has been edited. But the bottom line is that if you have access to if your property has access to a private road or access drive, and those two things mean something slightly different under the code, but they're both private. Access drives just only serve 2 properties, and private roads serve 3 or more. Then anyone else who has the right to use that road has to consent to your marijuana business. And that's been the case since 2016, and it's the case for home occupations. I think it's just there's a couple different kinds of home occupations that also, we've had that standard in place for a number of years. So it's definitely different than most uses. In most cases, you don't need to get that permission.
And that's only when you apply for the permit to.
Correct. It's a
If
one-time.
somebody sells their property
Right.
and they're now on the private road, they can't say,
No.
I
Nope.
object.
That's correct. It's one time. So if you get the approval and you start your business, we don't, take that away from you based on a change in ownership or sentiment. Yes, that's right.
Do we have any input for change from the growers themselves that they'd like to see us change to?
I don't have anything official. The biggest, I'm sure the less restrictions, better, would be typically it. But I think, no, we haven't gotten a lot of organized pushback that I know of, with the exception of on the processing side. They would like to be able to process extracts. The mysterious they, would like to be able to process marijuana extracts in our agricultural zones. And that was considered in 2017 and rejected by the board at that time, and the board is not interested in relooking at that question at this time.
I see.
So that seems to be the thing that keeps coming up regularly, but, yeah.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I will admit that my initial reaction is to agree with Mary around this concept of basing it based on an acreage, because I think it allows us to split that difference between all or nothing, and also allows us to effectively regulate the implications. And so my question is, if we went that route, has staff given any thought at all to what the appropriate number of licensees per acre might be, and if there's a cap, what it should be? And I think if that's on the table, I'm looking at you, and my guess was right that no, that hasn't been considered, but if there was a recommendation of some sort, considering it's on the table, I think that might help us in our
Okay.
deliberations.
Yeah, we'll talk it over. I have a feeling it's like so many other standards. There's no
Right. I
magic
mean,
number,
yeah,
but maybe
it-
we could think of something.
I
that
have
makes
a
sense.
tentative
If-
starting
if you-
point.
If you had a starting point that you felt was reasonable, I think that would help us
Right.
move more quickly, right?
So,
I have a tentative starting point if you want to look into it
Sure.
from there. I was, based on just what we've been saying and the other sizes we've been looking at, I was thinking of something that per lot of record, because you said that was easiest to administer, maybe one licensee per 5 acres up to a total of 5.
Okay.
So if you have,
What I
you
was
know,
thinking. Right.
I have a suggestion for purposes of you actually noticing this. If you notice the least restrictive option, you said that we can always make recommendations that are a little bit more liberal in this conversation.
Notify the most restrictive.
I mean, most
And
restrictive,
yes,
sorry.
You are correct.
So
Yes.
if you do notify most restrictive, which you said was 1 lease per tract,
Correct.
then that means that we could take public testimony.
Yes.
And based on public testimony and the input we're going to get in our actual meeting, make a determination whether or not it's appropriate, based on feedback at that time, to go to something that is more acreage-based,
Yes.
rather than noticing for acreage and jumping to that point without any public input.
Yes. Yes.
It's a-
Yeah,
it's a
absolutely.
better
And I
approach.
think,
The approach you're taking is the right approach.
yes, the notice is pretty much out of the, like, the horse has kind of left the barn.
Right.
Already, as of like today. So we did make the decision to go and notify the most restrictive.
Most, yeah.
Because we felt like the board probably wanted to have that on the table, and we didn't want to get to a public hearing and have to say, oh, I'm sorry, but you can't consider that because we didn't, so this way. But I also think staff can certainly consider these other options and be sort of prepared to comment on how an acreage standard might play out and what would be the pros and cons of how that would work.
Will give us an opportunity to also see what they think.
Yeah.
Right, I think, as always, public testimony, I think, will change a lot of hearts and minds and give us a lot to think
Yeah.
about,
So in light of that, next steps. Today, the notice went to the state, because we have a 5-week notification requirement for Department of Land Conservation and Development. And at the same time, we notify our neighborhood planning organizations and various other interested parties, cities, and et cetera. So that happened today. The public notice to property owners in the EFU, TBR, and Ag Forest districts is going next week in batches. It's approximately 13,000 notices. So we call out the duplicates and whatnot, but
Are we going to have the meeting here?
yes, we are. And we'll talk about that plan in a second. So the Planning Commission hearing November 26th, and the Board of County Commissioners won't hear it until January 16th. So if you need a continuance, which based upon the amount of testimony might be quite possible, then that's December 10th. That's the date that we've reserved for that continuation. We haven't met, we've just preliminarily discussed. We thought about, do we rent another place? And I don't know, the sort of general consensus from everybody was, no, we're going to try to make this work. So we've got overflow. There's 2 rooms over in this hallway that have the ability to listen in audio-wise. We're going to be well-staffed. It will not just be me. There'll probably be at least a half a dozen people here from the planning department. We'll have a plan, just like we did when we had the meeting in Oregon City for the 400 people, for how people sign in and what kind of information we give out to them and how many people can come in at one time. And I would imagine that, and I feel like this, I'll be surprised if it generates as much interest as the first round, because we're not talking about something that's brand new legalization of marijuana. And we notified the entire county when we did it the first time. It wasn't just the EFU, TBR, and Ag Forest, it was everyone. So I think it will be less, but I think there will be a lot of people here. And so I think you would be looking at limitation, whether it's 3 minutes per person, having some kind of limit on the amount of time that we would be wanting to queue people up and, have them coming up in twos and all that stuff to try to keep the hearing flowing as efficiently as we can. So,
Remember that one meeting where we had this onslaught and this place didn't cover it, and it took a while to figure out how to
yeah.
make that work.
How to
so-
make it work. Yeah, I think we'll be a little more prepared this time. Yes.
Been through this a
Right.
couple times now.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel like more of an expert. So yes, we'll definitely have a plan.
And it sounds like the parking lot might be full.
It might, yeah, you might want to get here early if you want to
I'm
park.
gonna be a little late. I'm flying in that day, so.
So, yeah, I
So
don't
I might
know.
have pla-
I
might
mean,
not have
there's
placed a
obviously, there's a
park,
lot
huh?
of other parking on the county campus.
Uber
Oh, hey,
route.
Ellen's here. She's going to be responsible for making sure we have a plan. Anyway, there's a lot of other parking on the campus, just
Yeah,
maybe
it's-
not right
I'm
outside
just
the
joking.
building. So, yeah, yeah, it might be a challenge. I had another thought, but now it seems to have escaped me. Anyway, we will do our best to make it go as smoothly as we possibly can for you. So, oh, I know what it was. I don't think anybody's told me they can't be here on the 26th.
I can't be here on the 26th.
Okay,
I'll
so we
be
have
here.
8.
But my flight arrives at 5, so I might be a little late, but I'll be here.
Okay, so we have 7. I'm seeing 7 yeses, 1 no, and a probably.
It'll be continued.
If I fall below a quorum with 600 people here to testify, it is not going to be a good night. So please, please, please come.
People in this room.
We cannot take testimony unless there's 5 of you here. So if anything comes up, please let Darcy and I know as soon as possible. But we really need as many of you as we possibly can. So.
I'll be here, but
You'll be late.
I might be late. My flight arrives at 5.
Don't you still have pull at the airport? Can't you get them to get you in early?
I have no pull whatsoever out there anymore. I have to pay to park out there now, too.
So yeah, 6:30, November 26th.
Okay, so it's 8:20.
Yeah.
We have a couple of other things on our agenda. I think we've been here for 2 hours. You want to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll do the minutes, and we'll talk really briefly about training, and then we can adjourn. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, that's fine. Or if you feel like you've been here longer than we don't have to do the training tonight. There's no urgency to it. That was something that we had discussed, and I'm happy to do it. But if everybody feels like they're on information overload, there's no time sensitivity to it.
And your goal was just to have a fairly brief conversation about what types of training we might want to do?
So I
Is that-
have a PowerPoint that Mike affectionately called Planning 101 that he prepared before he retired. That is a pretty high-level view of planning in Oregon. Mary will know all of it already. And a lot of it will be repeat for you guys. But Mary and Brian and I had talked about possible training opportunities for the Planning Commission moving forward. There are some other things we can do, but this was just sort of the basic, like, oh, well, we've got this thing, and it's a pretty good presentation. Let's go ahead and do it. But it's not at all time sensitive. We could table it.
I think we have everyone here. It's good to do at least something. But
I was
that's my
just going
thoughts.
to look to the new commissioners and ask, I think you guys would welcome this, if my recollection is right. We are all here. So why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then if we have people mutiny, we can reconsider that.
Review the minutes before we do that, so we have it on the record.
Right, because we're going to, we're not going to film the training. So
Right.
maybe we should go ahead and finish those other little items and then take the break.
So we're still not going to adjourn the meeting, though? We're just then going to break on the video? Okay, so
Yep.
let's go ahead and, has everyone had a chance to review the minutes, and is there anyone that would like to move to approve the minutes from,
I have some
September
notes on
10th.
the minutes. On
Mary has notes? Go ahead.
the first page, item number 1, that first full paragraph, the second sentence isn't clear to me what it actually means. We are not actually any proposed text amendments. I think there's just a missing word or something.
Making,
Not reviewing, proposing,
Making,
making,
not actually making any proposed text amendments.
suggesting.
yeah.
How about saying there are no proposed text amendments to the plan?
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
And then, bottom of the page, there was no public testimony and not agencies, CPOs. I think no agencies, CPOs. I think that's just a typo.
And would you like to approve those, or?
Sorry, where was that again?
Single sentence, fourth paragraph from the bottoms, there was no public testimony and not agencies, I think, and no agencies, CPOs, Hamlets.
Actually, I think it'd be no public testimony, no agencies.
Yep.
CPOs, hamlets, or villages, the and is not necessary.
So I'm hearing that as a motion with the proposed edits.
I would have moved to approve the minutes with the proposed edits as noted by myself and Commissioner Fitz.
Second it?
Second by Louise. Any other discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
We got some
didn't vote. I wasn't there.
abstentions.
I wasn't here.
I'm sorry. So the.
Three
There are
abstentions.
3 abstentions, and let's indicate who those are. Murph, Mike, and Tom.
Well, no, I'm an
You
aye.
and I. Steve, Mike, and Tom.
Stephen, Michael, and, yeah.
Sorry about that.
So there's 4 abstentions?
3.
Three.
Steve, Mike, Tom.
Okay.
Murph voted aye.
I was here.
And then just one other item under schedule review. We've obviously already covered what's coming up in terms of ZDO 271. The other thing is a somewhat, although not entirely, unexpected addition to the work program. There are, as I'm sure Commissioner Murphy probably already knows, new floodplain maps coming for the Sandy River Basin, which affects the city of Sandy, Multnomah County, Clackamas County. This process has been going on since 2012. There's already been quite a bit of public outreach. In some cases, the floodplain is getting bigger. In some places, it's getting smaller. But the bottom line for the county is that if we want to stay members of the National Flood Insurance Program, we have to adopt the new maps. And potentially some revisions to our floodplain management ordinance. We are still waiting for comments from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Department of Land Conservation and Development, but we expect there will be some technical amendments to the code. This is a situation where the policy choices are few. Do you want to be in the flood insurance program or don't you? Adopt it or don't, I think, is kind of in a nutshell how it works. So we have a deadline, however. Sadly, they gave us 6 months warning on the maps, but we still don't have the edits to the code, and yet we have to have it all adopted by the 18th of January. So it's a very tight timeline with the way land use works in Oregon. It doesn't necessarily fit really well with the way FEMA is providing comments, but we've got to just do the best we can. So we are gearing up to send notice for that. Another postcard will be much smaller, not 13,000, but anybody who's in the anybody who's in that floodplain area will get notified whether their situation's getting, we're not going to try to weed out whose situation's getting better or worse or whatever. It's just you're going to get a postcard saying we're doing this. And so we're going to do that on December 10th because we have to in order to hit our deadline. So even though you will also potentially be continuing the marijuana discussion, we're going to need to do the floodplain ordinance the same night. And I think based upon I think we should get a sense of what happens on the 26th to decide how we want to schedule those, because we may just want to go ahead and knock the floodplain stuff out in the first hour or something and then move on rather than, wait until, so we'll kind of regroup after the 26th and decide on that. But that is coming. So that's all I have.
And that's only for the adoption of the maps.
For the adoption of the maps, and then, which, are already finalized by FEMA. And if they require any amendments to our floodplain code, which is basically the standards that apply if somebody wants to build a house in the floodplain or, those kinds of things, they're apparently reviewing our ordinance, and there may be some edits that we need to make in order to stay in compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. And I don't know that we know exactly what those are. Steve Henchko was going to actually reach out to Washington County, I think, because they're having the same issue. And so we're kind of figuring that whatever they tell us to do is probably similar to what they've already told Washington County they need to do. So we can kind of get a heads up on what that might be.
I could ask for disaster management to come in, and Jay Wilson of Disaster
Oh, sure,
Management to come in. He'd gladly come in and give a talk on it.
Oh, okay. Well, let's wait and see. I don't know if we're going to have time on the 10th, but yes, I know Jay's been really involved, and our staff has as well. So Steve Henchko will be here that night, and probably Melissa Ahrens as well, kind of running that project. So I think we're probably okay, but we can talk about it or offline if you want.
Yes, we have a meeting on November 5th, and that's on the CMZ.
Correct.
Channel
Yes.
Migration Zone.
Yes, which
trying
is
to
a
bring
much,
state policy.
Yeah,
to it.
much bigger effort. This is just what do we need to do to, what are the minimum requirements we have to meet to stay compliant with the flood insurance program? So.
So let's go ahead and recess for 5 minutes or less and get back here as quickly as we can so we can wrap up the evening.